So I'd like to begin by allowing each of our panelists to say a few words about their engagement with the questions of poetry and poetics as it relates to this particular forum. And to have a panel simply on poetry is so hopelessly broad that we may end up just having 4 different conversations. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but I hope that we can also kind of return to or circle around the question of poetry, poetic kind of transactions across national borders. And we have a group that's uniquely well suited to thinking about this question from a variety of perspectives today. Anjum, her novel title, The Cosmopolitans, itself kind of bespeaks an interest in these questions. And I'm particularly curious to hear about your experience as an editor at Caravan and what kinds of outlook beyond India's borders might be occurring in that kind of editorial project and what may not be happening, and learn more about that process. Rosinka has brings a kind of historical perspective on Indian poetry and the British tradition and kind of histories of colonization, decolonization, and empire. John, being a poet who's worked both in the UK and US contexts, now has turned to a new project involving Indian poet who we may hear more about in the next hour. And Sumana has very kindly agreed to join our panel. Said some very interesting things yesterday about how these questions play out in the classroom, involving encouraging students to use Indian forms like the bhajan and others, ghazal, but using those Indian forms in English medium poems, which I think has an interesting kind of international importation of form or exportation of form. I'm not sure how you would actually describe it, but it's fascinating in light of what we're talking about today. So maybe I'll begin by asking you all to just speak briefly off the cuff on whatever interests you about today's conversation. And then we'll open things up, perhaps maybe even a little bit earlier than usual, to a kind of open conversation with you all, and also among ourselves. So if you have questions for each other, please feel free to jump in with them as well. And maybe I won't, I'll move this way down the table, beginning with Anjum, if that sounds good.
I thought since it's a panel on poetry, we should have a poem. And so, yes, Surya, can we have the poem? I don't know why this morning I'm coming back so much to creative writing, because it's not something that is usually dominant in my thinking, but maybe it's because of Ashoka and Chicago and yesterday's conversation. But so I sort of want to connect back to what I said in the previous panel, which is that I am trying to, in some sense, ask myself what it means to teach creative writing, and then, and as part of that, of course, also poetry. And I just wanted to share this poem because I use it very often when I'm teaching the poetry class. And Adam Zagajewski, a Polish poet, about whose poetry I have read, but about whom I don't know very much. And so when I share this poem, I'm sharing this as one among lots of other poems. So there's no necessarily, not necessarily any sense of tradition or history. I'm sharing this as a poem. And when I do it, I have to confess to a slight feeling of anxiety, maybe even resentment, because I feel this is my poem. This is a poem I really like very much. and now I have let it out. And how are people going to respond to this poem? Should we read it or can? Okay, okay. Can you see it, everyone? Yeah. Self-portrait. Between the computer, a pencil, and a typewriter, half my day passes. One day it will be half a century. I live in strange cities and sometimes talk with strangers about matters strange to me. I listen to music a lot. Bach, Mahler, Chopin, Shostakovich. I see three elements in music: weakness, power, and pain. The fourth has no name. I read poets, living and dead, who teach me tenacity, faith, and pride. I try to understand the great philosophers, but usually catch just scraps of their precious thoughts. I like to take long walks on Paris streets and watch my fellow creatures, quickened by envy, anger, desire, to trace a silver coin passing from hand to hand as it slowly loses its round shape. The emperor's profile is erased. Beside me, trees expressing nothing but a green, indifferent perfection. Black birds pace the fields, waiting patiently like Spanish widows. I'm no longer young, but someone else is always older. I like deep sleep when I cease to exist, and fast bike rides on country roads, when poplars and houses dissolve like cumuli on sunny days. Sometimes in museums, the paintings speak to me and irony suddenly vanishes. I love gazing at my wife's face. Every Sunday, I call my father. Every other week, I meet with friends, thus proving my fidelity. My country freed itself from one evil. I wish another liberation would follow. Could I help in this? I don't know. I'm truly not a child of the ocean, as Antonio Machado wrote about himself, but a child of air, mint, and cello, and not all the ways of the high world cross paths with the life that, so far, belongs to me. So, when I'm trying to discuss this poem, I think there are two ways of trying to make meaning in poetry. Neither might lead us anywhere, but there are definitely, I think, two different approaches. One is to assume that the poem has meaning, right? And to discuss how is the poet creating that meaning? How is he deploying a literary language? What are the effects that he's using? Or what is he using to create literary effects? How is he using irony? How is he using the ellipses? There are a lot of ellipses in this poem. How is he using juxtaposition? Why is there the museum after he's gazed at his wife's face and not before? Why is there music after whatever comes before it, right? So how does he make these jumps? How does he make these connections? So this is, in my understanding, a question about poetics, the word in the title of this panel, which is that every poet has a poetics, and our job when we're trying to understand a poem is to ask, what is this particular poet's poetics in this poem? Now, when I do this in the class, I'm assuming that that question is enough, right? That we're discussing how the poem became a poem. But what I'm not understanding, and which I usually realize belatedly, is that not everyone is already in consensus about the fact that that poetry has meaning. That something like this form of language already has a particular value. Right? Now that is something I would take for granted, that there is something like poetic language which is used in different ways to create effects, and that language has value. And what I realize when I teach this in a class of people who may not have read very much of poetry is that I actually can't take that for granted. And not only because they haven't read poetry, they may not care for poetry, or they may not subscribe to that consensus about the value of poetry as I'm doing. Right? Am I clear about this distinction? Is it making sense at all? This idea that, something like this, which is personal, idiosyncratic, and is clearly a poem, already has an assumed value. I'm assuming there is a value in this, and I'm bringing it into the classroom as an example of that value, and then we're just discussing how is it coming together.
Let me ask you a question already. So, in a way, you can think about that question as what makes this legible as a poem, right, within the context of the Bangalore workshops that you're doing, right? Whereas other things that might be called poems may not be read as such, right? And it might have something to do with the cosmopolitanism of the poem, right? The poem, by the third line says, "I live in strange cities and sometimes talk with strangers about matters strange to me," right? That is the cosmopolitan condition, right? So is there something that kind of draws you to that as a marker, or what that endows this poem with a kind of portability that allows it to be legible within the Indian context, or?
I think so. I think I'm responding to the cosmopolitan quality of the poem, but also the melancholy, the feeling of a sort of broken beauty that is there in Zagajewski. I mean, he has this famous poem, Try to Praise the Mutilated World. I think Vivek mentioned this yesterday, the idea of saying one thing and meaning another, suggestiveness. And when I'm talking to my students about poetry, they come into the poetry class saying, we may have read a little bit of poetry or not, maybe not at all, but we believe that if we can understand form and technique, then we will be better appreciators of poetry, right? So tell us about meter, tell us about rhyme, tell us about how you make, so again, technical questions, right? And then when I try to break that down, I realize what they're actually asking me is not so much, it's not so much they want an education in poetry, but they want to understand how to develop taste. How can I judge poetry? That's what they're actually asking when they're saying, teach us how to tell, break down a poem. Teach us technique. When they're saying teach us technique, I realize what they're actually saying is, how do I judge, right? And this poem doesn't help them to do that, because unless I actually can step back and say why this is, valuable as an instance of poetry, why is this good poetry? And I'm already assuming that, right? And I'm also feeling that that's a question that is very difficult to answer, maybe impossible, right? So basically what I'm trying to talk about is there a consensus on poetry as something that is of value? And I'm not sure that there is, and I'm not sure this is the best example. Maybe if I had Wordsworth, it might be easier in some way because they've read that in school. So how do I take a modern poem and use that as an example? The other way to do it is through biography. So to present the history of Poland, or to present Zagajewski's own story, and I'm not doing that. And like I said at the beginning, I don't even know so much about him because I don't think that's so important. So before this panel, I was just chatting with Srikanth and John, and I said, this poet who I really admire, and I want to share a poem of his, and they were like, perfect choice, because he just retired from the University of Chicago. And I didn't know that. I thought he was sitting in some small town in Poland being miserable. So I don't want to necessarily take that route, but yeah, maybe John can help us here about what route to take. But I'll stop here for the moment and come back to the caravan question later.
I just wanted to ask, when you say... I wanted to ask, when you talk about value and poetic language, are you therefore, you're talking about presumptions we make when we come to poetry. Are we therefore making a presumption that poetry is a foreign language?
Yeah, I mean, one response to this often is disappointment. When I present this poem, it's disappointment because they're like, how is this different from prose? So, the feeling that poetry is something alien, but something special, a language that I can crack if I study it in the right way, and I'm not helping them by giving them this example. So it is a foreign language, but how do we teach it? Somehow I assume that, that even though you think it's a foreign language, there's something that you've already got, and that assumption may be wrong, right? It is entirely foreign, it turns out.
Have you tried taking out the line breaks and putting them as a paragraph, and then to ask the question whether they think of this as a poem?
Well, when we start breaking it down, like I was referring to earlier, what are the choices he's making in the narrative? Then maybe something opens up because they realize that it's not as straightforward as it seems, right? it's not narrative in a linear way. It is narrative, but not in a linear way. And what are the choices that he's making to break that linearity? So then, okay, then maybe there's one or two moments of.
Well, nobody has mentioned that this poem is in itself a translation into English from Polish. Yeah, which I think it's working now. Which is one reason I think that it is closer to prose than one might expect of a poem written in English, because the poem is remarkably devoid of many of the non-semantic aspects of poetic language, and to that extent is relatively close to prose. And I guess the other question about, is this a poem when you bring it into a class, is if you bring it into the class, it is a poem. Just as if you place something in a gallery, it is a work of art. I mean, okay. So I thought that I would pick up on the questions of situatedness, which seem to pervade the earlier debate, and some of those yesterday. And I begin to talk about that through my sense of my own situatedness as an English poet working in the United States. And I have to say that when I was in England, I would never have described myself as an English poet. It is only in recent years that I have made that distinction. When I was a young writer, American poetry was of enormous importance to me. And it's only since coming to the US that I have recognized how far my assumptions about poetic language, poetic form, depart from those of my American contemporaries. And I realized this most vividly when I went back to England recently and I picked up a pamphlet by some young poets in their 20s. And I immediately felt this sense of extraordinary and delighted recognition that this was work which was both deeply implicated in a particular tradition of lyric language and had a sense that almost any kind of concern was a poetic concern, available to poetry, and that it also had a kind of vehemence which was on the verge of madness, which I associate with the kind of English poetry that I enjoy. And I recognized that the real difference there from American poets in their 20s is that they are all doing projects. And the sense is that the work is, to me, as an English writer, that the work is not motivated by some kind of obscure necessity that then struggles into form, but rather that a series of propositions, programmatic propositions, are made in advance. And this indeed might be something that has emerged out of the MFA to a large extent. So I'll just talk a little bit first about, or second, about where I come from and how that relates to international writing. I occupy a microclimate of English poetry, which started to form as a cloud over Cambridge in the late 1960s, and which since then has gone on to conquer vast tracts extending as far as Brighton, which is about 200 miles to the south, and to Norwich, about 100 miles to the north. This, from an international perspective, there are two interesting contradictions here. In the English poetry of that time, the late 1960s, this was a group of poets who were remarkably international in their connections and interests. It was strongly linked to New York School poetry, to Black Mountain poetry in the United States, but also to contemporary German, French, and Italian poetry. And it has subsequently developed strong links with contemporary avant-garde Chinese poets and around a study institute at Sun Yat-sen in Guangzhou, which many of us visit quite frequently. And furthermore, this is poetry that acknowledged no limits in what was available to poetic treatment. So characteristically uses a great deal of scientific language, of the language of economics, specialist language of microbiology, and so on and so on. All of this is grist to the mill. So the contradiction here is that this poetry is routinely dismissed as completely unreadable in Britain. And one of the US's most influential literary critics, Steph Burt, has written about the peculiar resistance to travel of this writing. In other words, she has talked about how odd it is that work which comes out of seemingly a common Anglo-American modernist tradition has proved to be unpublishable, unreadable in the United States, other than by a few graduate students who are in love with difficulty. There are always some of those. So amidst this group, my own work, I realized in a rather disturbing experience in Paris, is perhaps uniquely impervious to translation. I had 3 days at the Maison de la Poésie in Paris with a group of French poets who were trying to translate some of my poems. And my idea of this was that I would sit there drinking rather good red wine and being admired and basking in this kind of adulation. It was not like that at all. It was extremely hard work and quite damaging to my ego. But what was most interesting about it to me, and I know some French, I've been translating to Chinese too, and I have no idea what those poems are like in Mandarin. I mean, no idea at all. But in French, since I have some competence in French, I was constantly being called on to explain myself. And in particular, the syntactical problems which emerged seemed impossible to resolve, since characteristically, a term or a verb in my text might have several different subjects and several different referents. And in French, this is impossible. They would say, you know, what does this verb link to? And I say, well, to that, that, and that. And they say, impossible, impossible. So what we ended up with was some very strange poems by a new French poet who wrote with a kind of lucidity and detachment which is completely alien to my work. I mean, I thought that they were quite admirable poems that these poets produced, but they certainly were not something that I could recognize as mine. The third thing I would just say about distinctions between kinds of poetry is that for me, the basic distinction of the kinds of poets I'm interested in, those I'm not, are the kinds of poets I'm interested in are world-making poets. That is to say that their work constitutes the development of a new language which needs to be learnt over some considerable period and to become familiar with. So that, I mean, in my own writing, I write book-length works whose development is by a kind of unhinged metaphorical process, so that the metaphor starts to take off on its own journeys, and it metastasizes across a considerable space. Writers in the European tradition, like, say, Paul Celan, are extremely congenial to me because their work needs to be understood through a process of kind of linguistic accommodation and entry. Whereas the kinds of writers I'm not interested in so much, I mean, I'm interested in everything, of course, but I'm less interested in poetically are those who are taking up a position of commentary and detached commentary on the world. Okay. So I like people like Samuel Beckett, but not Philip Larkin, for example. Okay. So that's just a sort of introduction to these questions. I mean, just to throw into this, the problem of relations between different kinds of English as well as other kinds of translation that I feel kind of agreeably alienated in some ways from contemporary American poetry.
So when Srikanth first wrote to us about what we'd be discussing on this panel, he'd said, so if each of you could introduce yourselves and speak about your poetry. And I sent this frantic and rather alarmed email saying, I am not a poet. I have written on poetry and criticism throughout my life, I now realize. But so then he very kindly sort of framed the question in a different way. So I realized only recently that the books that I've written right from my sort of DPhil, my PhD thesis onward, which was on Indian poets writing in English in the 19th century, to the one that appeared more recently, which is on Bengali poets in the same period, through sort of editions of Derozio and editions of sort of Indian poetry in English. It was pointed out to me by Amit, in fact, that you seem to have an appreciation for, or at least you tend to gravitate towards the minor. And this is indeed true, I realize, although I'd sort of become self-conscious about it only in the last book I wrote about the Bengali poets, because the poets in it were all quote-unquote minor poets. I wanted to say a little bit about sort of, what I've written about and where I come from, because I wanted to address the question that Srikanth put to us in the email that followed the second email, in the context of my knowledge of Bengali poetry primarily, but also Indian poetry in English. We can discuss that if you want, because what he had said in that second email was, then perhaps we could just talk about how you see your own work or contemporary Indian poetry differently when viewed internationally, you said. And what that brought to mind was something I'd written about in The Literary Thing, which is about Bengali poetry in the late 19th century. This moment that actually Amit mentioned yesterday, when he spoke about Sahitya and how that's a newly sort of formulated word. It is in 1885 that Bankim Chandra Chatterjee actually asks this in an introduction he does for an older poet. He asks the question, what is a poet? That is my translation. He asks Kobi ke, who is the poet? So this is 1885, and he then actually says that in the past, so kavya, the word is the same in Bengali, kabbo, was essentially meant anybody who wrote in a literary manner. That could be about astronomy, and it could be about medicine, and it could be about grammar or literature. But anybody who wrote, in a particular way, that was what kavya was. Then he says, towards the beginning of the 19th century, that is in Bengal itself, he's discussing the local context, the Kobi was called the Kobial, and this was a performative sort of poetry where you had actually singer-songwriter competitions, and in a wealthy person's house, two teams would compete against each other, compose poetry or lyrics on the spot, and there would be a winner adjudicated. So this was a rather sort of lower form of, and he says, but now, and this is 1885, now when we say kavi or kobi, what we understand is of it as in the English sense of a poet. And here he simply uses the English word, poet. And he says, that he understands, that is, and he says, that is in the way in which we had Kalidas and Magh. So he's constructing a canon almost immediately. So the serious, the high, So the reason that I'm bringing up this whole, thing that I've discussed over there is because you then see how a poet in sort of a writer critic, and he started actually, very few people know this as a poet, that long ago was actually thinking about the issue of Indian poetry when viewed internationally, but in a very different way to what you meant when you asked the question, right? Because he's really concerned actually with his own tradition and with how to formulate it in his contemporary context. So that was one thing I wanted to sort of flag. The other was when the first panel was the discussion that was generated around the first panel, and the title itself, Literary Fiction in a Transnational Perspective, and I was immediately thinking, so it's significant that what you have up there is fiction. You don't say literature in a transnational, I mean, the panel wasn't called that. I mean, obviously, whoever thought of it, he says, it is literature that circulates. texts that circulate across national boundaries. That is what he recognizes to be world literature. Now, almost invariably, whether for Moretti or Damrosch, this is fiction. This is the novel. This is very rarely poetry. People don't speak about world literature in terms of poetry, or if they do, it's a sort of niche discussion within the larger discussion of sort of world literature. So the question that came to my mind really was, poetic transactions across national borders, you said, and I could think of that. But can we think of, does it travel in the same way? My feeling is it doesn't, and when it does travel, then, or in the sense in which, say, Neruda traveled to me when I was growing up, as I mentioned yesterday. So then, what is that form of travel that is specific to poetry? That was the second question sort of I had, and the third, lastly, again comes out of some of the discussion that was happening this morning. And I wanted to then introduce the notion of language and what language does to poetry, whether it's when we think of poetry written in the Indian languages, and when we think of poetry written in English, actually, interestingly, the same sort of pattern falls into place that that Amit spoke about in the morning session. But this one can show historically. It's very interesting that actually Indian poetry in English, when it began in 1827 with Derozio, right up till Torudutt in 1875, is actually generated around notions of identity and culture. There is a lot of explaining. There is a lot of information. It's very Orientalist. They actually, they're following Jones and Wilson, and actually, sort of, so Surya, they will say, and they'll have a footnote saying, the Indian Apollo. This is, this was the convention at the time. So all of it is actually not very good poetry. It didn't sort of, wasn't recognized as good poetry until Torudutt in 1875, who suddenly breaks through with this very modernist poetry, modern poetry, not modernist, modern poetry, which is concerned with form, which is concerned with describing actually the local. So her best poetry is in her sonnets that are called Our Casuarina Tree, or Bagmari, where she's describing just the garden outside her window. So interestingly then, poetry in Bengali, so that's in the English language. In the English language, it's all identity and culture till we get to Torudutt in 1875. And in Bengali poetry, but very interestingly, right from the beginning, almost right from the beginning, Michael Madhusudhan Dutta, when he's writing in the 1860s, is entirely about form, is entirely about, about bringing sort of different forms into. So he brings the sonnet, he brings blank verse, he brings all of this into Bengali poetry. His entire preoccupation is with the modern, with form, and with what at that time was the avant-garde. And then in relation to the question Shinjini asked, I thought while the discussion was going on, and I didn't want to sort of, so I thought I'd bring it up here. Very interestingly, this is a man who actually, I think, thought in English. He thought in English, wrote his first poems in English, but then turned to the Bengali language. So this, and then this brought to mind Ramanujan, and of course the famous, the brain has two lobes, and the famous sort of, sort of inhabiting two language worlds at the same time. So I think Shinjini is a very difficult thing to say, that nowadays, because we're all pan-Indian and all anglicized in a way that, our ancestors weren't, that we sort of, don't sort of, so fewer people maybe tend to think in Bengali and then write in English. One could say that, and then I thought, but Michael in the 1860s was thinking in English, writing his letters in English, but writing his poetry in Bengali. So I think it's a more complicated sort of, process that's at work there, which, so Ramanujan spoke of inner forms and outer forms, but again, I think we need to introduce the thought, the notion of language, and what language does to poetry, and to the notion of poetry traveling, perhaps. Thanks.
Should I'll take off from where Anjum started. Maybe we could talk about the poetic, since the distinction between prose and the poem for Anjum students, or students that I am imagining, seems to be, what is it that makes it a poem? I'll speak for a little while on what constitutes the poetic for me, as you told me this morning. I think for me, poetry and philosophy exist in a space where there is almost no blur. There is no blur. And I think there is a reason, as I've said often, that philosophy is called darshan. It's about seeing. So any person, whether he or she is writing in prose or in verse, anyone who can make me see in a different way is a poet for me. And anything that can make me see, whether it is cinema or whichever form it might be, is a poem, or is that person is a poet. The other thing I wanted to talk about is what makes a thing poetic for me is, for lack of a better word, surprise. We spoke about it. I heard people speaking about it in the morning. I think the unexpectedness. Frost talks about it often, not starting somewhere as a writer or as a poet, not knowing where he's going to get to. So I think this journey from the beginning to the end of verse or whatever the form might be should produce a moment of unexpectedness that used to be called epiphany, but I think we need a slightly different word for what I'm trying to talk about. What Rinkadi said about language, I think it's the language and the form that makes a poem. That is why I asked you this question, Anjum, whether you would change the lines and, make it read like a paragraph, and whether it would still be a poem. I'll go back to Frost again. He said, the sound is the gold in the ore. So that's another thing that constitutes something about language and the poem for me, how I hear it. And I'm not talking about the difference between page poem and performance poetry or the oral, but when I hear it, perhaps from the way you read it for us, and the way you would read a paragraph from your novel, for instance, the way you read it and the way I hear it is also different. I think it's about tonality. So to go back to what Shoykot was saying, the Bangla novel in English, I think it comes from there too. It's not about culture so much as hearing it, the tonality of that space that comes to us from language. Because Srikanth asked me to speak about my own practice, I think something that appeals to me, and this again I have discovered about myself from reading and listening to Amit Chaudhuri, is my affinity for the found aesthetic. I like writing about place. I live in a small town called Shiliguri in Bengal. And I found that I wanted to write about this place. And the only way that I could do it, it's a sub-Himalayan town. So it would have perhaps made sense to write about the Himalayas and the mountains and the Teesta that flows by. But I found myself gravitating towards, for lack of a better word, I can't think of one now, representing my town or writing about my town through sound. And the aesthetic that I found closest to was the found aesthetic. That I could write about people, what they were saying, and two of the ways in which I could do this was by reproducing what I heard, and the other was onomatopoeia, what I was talking about yesterday and with you too, Srikanth. That also helped me, and because you asked me to bring it up today in the morning, I'll just go back to the example that I gave yesterday. Which is, for those of you who were not there, I gave this example of the Ashoka graduation photograph and all the photographs being the same. Jasmine is shaking her head. And in one, a crow flows by. and the crow is there in the photo. So I give this example to my students often, that if you come back after 10 years, all the other photos would be news. The photo with the crow in it would be literature. So, or for me, the poetic. So what is it that is making it poetic? And that is why we mentioned, or I mentioned, uselessness or surplus in that context. So I also want to go back to just very briefly what Anjum said, that if I had given them, instead of this poem, she said, if she had given them a poem from Wordsworth, perhaps her students, and she's imagining a hypothetical situation, of course, her students would be able to recognize this as a quote-unquote poem. I'm not sure about that again, because I feel close to Wordsworth in a way that I have only discovered recently, because I wasn't an admirer of Wordsworth in the way that I was of Coleridge or Keats. I think Wordsworth is our ancestor in terms of bringing the modern into the poem. I was reading the preface to Lyrical Ballads, and he talks about how he calls these poems as experiments, and he says the reason he wants to write these poems is to bring in the language of the middle class and the lower class. These are his words, and I'm quoting him here. So poetry, therefore, and this is the reason. So what is the language of the middle and the lower classes? And how is this language different from what class is this, what class of person or people is this poem coming from? Which social class is this coming from? So I ask this question not in an anthropological way, but as something that has to do with form. So I've spoken about this before, that it's not a coincidence that Wordsworth and Coleridge are writing the Lyrical Ballads in 1798, 9 years after the French Revolution. And we grew up reading about this in university. Why is the Lyrical Ballads a revolutionary book? How was it affected by the French Revolution? And we didn't find anything about the French Revolution in the book. But for the first time in English poetry, after Shakespeare, and that is why the Romantics go back to Shakespeare so often, to Shakespeare's Fool, for instance, we have characters like the solitary reaper, the idiot boy, characters that had not been written about in poetry. I think modern poetry, and I want to ask John why he doesn't like Larkin. I think modern poetry is about all these places and all these people, not necessarily in a democratic way, the way we understand democracy. I'm not talking about a parliament of poets or parliament of people, not in this particular way, but in being able to give space to different kinds of languages that people speak and the different forms these might give birth to.
So I had, yeah, sure. So in fact, Sumana ended with this question of sort of languages. I wanted to ask John, in fact, because we Indians on the panel sort of automatically take for granted the many different languages in which poetry is written in this country. And as she was saying, sort of, so we need to hear, you were saying, a language in its sort of, a place, in its space, and And then I was just thinking from what John was describing regarding his own poetry and from his own sort of situatedness. How, at least in India certainly, and I'm not sure whether that's true of everywhere, how we tend to think of English as a transparent language. So from what John described of his situatedness and of the difficulty in translating it into French, and of what, when we read him as a poet, as an English poet or as a poet writing, we don't think of his situatedness at all. We just think of it, he's an English poet, that's the language belongs to him, he's writing English poetry. Whereas if we were to talk about Kannada poetry or Bengali poetry, immediately Sumana would say, or I would say, you have to be sensitive to the context, you have to understand the space from which it's coming, you have to, understand the traditions. I was just wondering whether we whether we hear English in the same way in which we hear poetry in the Indian languages. That was a question about the transparency of English. And the other one was, again, a sort of very familiar concept and word that I wanted to introduce to the discussion, which came out of I don't know if it came out of what Sumana was saying about sound, because I think I've just went off in a completely different direction, but she spoke about sound. And this reminded me of the early poet that, Bengali poet that nobody would be familiar with, and I'm not assuming that familiarity, somebody who was writing in the 1840s and 50s, who was actually not considered a poet at all, even by Bankim Chandra, who was writing the introduction, Ishwar Chandra Gupta. He writes this very, very interesting sort of poetry describing the urban in Calcutta in the 1850s. So he has a poem called Ingraji Noboborsho, for instance, describing the year 1852 and describing English celebration. So this is the English New Year, Ingraji Noboborsho, the English New Year. We all have a different New Year, as you know, in India. Each of our regions have, we have our own New Year. But of course, once the English came and you had the English New Year, so he's describing that. And he's describing that with something that in my book I've called the sound image. Because what he's doing, and it's only when I read him for the first time that I realized how different it all must have sounded to his ears. So he's describing the sound of cutlery, the sound of dancing, the sound of the English drinking and eating, talk, talk, shop, shop, shoppa, shop. He actually describes, so it's very onomatopoeic, but he actually describes, and then you suddenly realize, this must sound so foreign to him, the sound of cutlery on a plate. For the first time, so from there then this notion of the poetic, what he's doing there, so he's never recognized by Bankim Chandra and the poets that immediately follow as a poet, because he doesn't deal in what Bankim terms the poetic, because Bankim's notion of the poetic is very romantic. With the moderns, with the modernists, and with, in the 20th century, of course, so the word and the concept that I wanted to introduce was defamiliarization, because Ishwar Chandra, of course, is exactly that. So now we can recognize him as a poet because he's so modernist almost, and because what he's doing is familiar to us from modernist poetry. But this notion of strangeness and this notion of defamiliarization was what we understood poetry to be, a particular strain of poetry, not romantic poetry, but modernist poetry was sort of right from Shklovsky down through the 20th century. You thought of poetry as that which made things strange. So what is the poetic, that which yeah, no, I don't have the I don't have the time either, I think. So just these two.
I'll just start to answer your question to me by noting that The Solitary Reaper is a particularly interesting poem to identify for talking about plain English, because at its heart is an absence. The Solitary Reaper is actually singing in Gaelic. So that's an indication of what cannot be reproduced at that time by Wordsworth, and what is outside the linguistic sphere of, even though he's talking about representing the common people. It's the common people speaking in English. So as for transparency in English, it's true that there is a reduced kind of world English, and there have been various endeavors back to the idea of basic English in the 1930s to produce an English which is a purely transparent medium for business communication. And if you go to China, you hear that English quite a lot spoken, and spoken skillfully. But poets, I think, the idea that English is a transparent language, I immediately think of watching The Wire. I need to turn on the subtitles to watch The Wire. I simply am completely lost with the language there. So English is not transparent in that sense, in that evidently in dialect it's extremely various. But when it comes to literary English, and I think probably that's what you're referring to about transparency, one of the features that is a distinguishing feature for me of poetry is opacity and resistance. And it could be that this is something which is or has developed contingently on the pretensions of English to be a world language and to be transparent. That it's a response to that poets are insisting that the language is not simply a vehicle for taking units of information from one place to another, but is in itself generative, is in itself productive, and therefore are exploiting all of the sonic and other attributes of language in the thickest possible way in order to ensure that a reader cannot for a moment read this piece of language as simply imparting a set of information about what lies outside the text. Now, at its greatest extreme, this leads to poems of high artifice, such as those of John Ashbery, for example, where to search for some external referent is futile, although people try very hard to do this, and increasingly there's a tendency to say, oh, he was a gay poet, so everything must be about his situation as a gay man. But Ashbery himself was strongly averse to such reductive interpretations. So I think that, or what interests me, I suppose, is the way in which out of a kind of matrix of language which is extremely thick and opaque, something starts to struggle into recognizable meaning. And I like poetry which ends up just on that edge, so that it feels like each time you read it, an event of emergence, rather than an object on the page. So my two favorite poets are very different from each other, are Percy Shelley and Frank O'Hara. And in their different ways, I get that from both of them. I guess that all of this eventually takes us back, as so much has here, to the politics of translation. And I have been very struck by the idea that in India, writers and many people, much of the population, are negotiating different kinds of translation, either consciously or effortlessly throughout the course of the day. In the United States, and of course this is highly politicized, and I've come to recognize how far that's the case. In the United States, the politics are much more around two languages in their relation, English and Spanish. So the Republicans are making fluency or adeptness in English a test of your Americanness. In the United Kingdom, there are not, the politics are much more localized. So in Wales, for example, the position of Welsh is, and has been for some time, is a live issue. And it's been interesting to see how when Welsh started to be stipulated as a language to be taught in schools, it stopped being cool among the young. Until then, it was a language you spoke in order that, those English people couldn't, it was a secret language. So I'll just make those points to start with that. About transparency in particular. Oh, why do I not like Larkin? I don't like Larkin for his sort of Little England position and his lack of interest in literature internationally. But more than that, he exemplifies a kind of, the most miserable kind of post-war reductive attitude towards or reaction against modernism. So there was, understandably, I think, a deep concern that some of the most significant of English language modernist poets were associated with profoundly reactionary politics. And there was a sense which Auden articulated quite eloquently that this was an outcome of a kind of irresponsible romanticism, which could and almost always would lead to kind of egotism and eventually, in his view, was dangerously close to espousing fascism, or could come dangerously. So the reaction to that was not to say that we want a writing which is more profoundly connected with kind of pressing social issues, but to retreat into this shell of an England that never really was. And to that extent, alas, one might see Larkin, who actually I don't detest so much now because I see him as a comic poet. After Brexit, Larkin looks comic, you know. Okay.
Thank you. Yes, please. Yes, yes.
As a modern poet in some way, but there's also there is something very old and familiar and comforting about Wordsworth in that way. When we've just read The Solitary Reaper, we've just read, a few of those poems, and so I keep trying to come back to the figure of the person not very familiar with poetry, and is treating poetry as an alien form, and let's think of Wordsworth as a metaphor rather than as a particular poet for something read in English, in childhood, in the classroom. And the danger of the formal qualities of this Wordsworth-like figure then becoming like a stand-in for what poetry is. So when you encounter them, you're like, okay, I know where I am. I am in the realm of poetry. But when those are missing, then how do you identify and how do you give value to poetry? So that's how I was using Wordsworth in contrast to Zagajewski.
Actually, do you have a brief response? Yes.
Would your students, or do you think your students would respond to Let Us Go, Then You and I, where the evening is set against, in the same way? Because it's a question of form for me. That's why I asked this question.
No, when I say comforting, I mean in the way that rhymes and meter of a certain kind can be comforting because you're not flailing about.
So thank you.